Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I've been here several times, although my fondest memory is when I was at Lackland Air Force Base for a month. I was an ROTC officer and was getting my boot training, so to speak. And so it goes back a long ways. That was before the Riverwalk or any of the modern developments. Well, I want to echo what the President said about teachers. I love to talk to teachers. I have the greatest respect for them. My wife, now retired, was an English teacher, high school teacher, and I know how hard you work. Teaching is difficult. Professors profess. That's easy to do. Teaching is a different thing altogether. Well, what I want to do tonight, this evening, is talk a little bit about this period of the early republic. The Empire of Liberty is a term that was used, not just by Jefferson, although he made it most famous, the remark, but John Adams, others referred to the United States as an empire of liberty. They didn't mean an empire in the 19th and 20th century sense. They meant a large country that, in this case, was devoted to liberty. The period that I'm concerned with, really from the Revolution to the second decade of the 19th century, is a period of extraordinary change. And one measure of that is the famous short story, Rip Van Winkle, by Washington Irving. Most of you are familiar with the story or have heard about it and may have even read it in high school. But Washington Irving was a conservative, had conservative sensibilities, and he was, I think, overwhelmed by the kinds of changes that he had experienced in his young life. And I think Rip Van Winkle was his effort to deal with those changes with his character, Rip. He has this character awake, as you know, from a sleep that had begun before the Revolution and lasted 20 years. When Rip entered his old village, he immediately comes back from this sleep, and he felt completely lost. The buildings, the faces, the names were all strange and incomprehensible. The very village was altered, wrote Irving. It was larger and much more populous, and idleness was no longer tolerated. The very character of the people seemed changed, wrote Irving. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it. Instead of the accustomed drowsy tranquility, there was a terrifying situation for Rip, who had an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. That point is an important one that takes place in this period. That is the kind of celebration of profit-making, making of money. Even the language was strange. Rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, liberty, in other words, were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. When people asked him on which side he voted, whether he was a Federal or a Democrat, Rip could only stare in vacant stupidity. I think that story, which became the most popular of Irving's short stories, I think people responded to it because it resonated with their sense themselves of having experienced great change. Everything seemed on the surface to be the same. George Washington's picture replaced George III's, but beneath the surface, everything had been altered. In a few short decades, Americans had experienced a remarkable transformation in their society, their culture, and like Rip and his creator, many wondered what had happened and who they really were. Now, before the Revolution of 1776, America had been merely a collection of disparate British colonies composed of some 2 million subjects huddled along a narrow strip of the Atlantic coast, sort of European outposts whose cultural focus was still London, which was the metropolitan center of their world. By 1815, not a long period of time in history, following a second war with Great Britain, often called the Second American Revolution. We're celebrating the bicentennial of that this year, of course. these insignificant provinces had become a single giant continental republic with nearly 10 million citizens, many of whom were already spilling out into the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the cultural focus of this huge, expansive nation was no longer abroad, no longer in London, no longer in Europe, but instead directed inward at its own boundless possibilities. Americans knew that they were a grand experiment in democracy, and they were confident, unbelievable confidence, that they could, by their own efforts, remake their culture, recreate what they thought, what they believed. Their revolution told them that people's birth did not count. This is probably the central fact of the revolution, a repudiation of birth, of blood, and that you might become what you wanted to become. Education became central to the revolution. In fact, it's the greatest period of educational writings in our history, that if you, in proportion to population, we had more educational publications in the revolutionary era than at any other time, and everybody tried his hand at working out a scheme of education, most of which we later implemented. Now, they didn't get implemented right away. It took another generation, until the 1830s and 40s, before you had the common school movement. But Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, all of the intellectuals are drawing up a three-tiered system, essentially what we have today, with elementary school, high school, and then college being the structure that's proposed. Everything seemed possible suddenly, and that, I think, is one of the central impulses of the so-called Enlightenment. The revolutionary leaders were faced with the awesome task of creating out of their British heritage their own separate national identity. Not an easy thing to do when you're not all, but mostly British. How do you distinguish yourself? That became a major issue. Even the name became a problem. What should we call ourselves? They played around with Columbia. At the tercentenary celebration of Columbus's discovery, 1792, they thought, well, Columbia sounds like a good name, and it has the right number of syllables. We could put as Britannia, the same number of syllables as Britannia. We could substitute for all these English songs. It would fit in beautifully. But that didn't stick. Samuel Mitchell, who was a senator and a physician, suggested Fredonia. And as far as I know, only the Marx Brothers picked that up, and that didn't stick either. But when you get to the issue of impressment, which you may be dealing with in some of your classes this year, which is the central cause of the War of 1812, impressment came from the fluid, uncertain nature of American nationality. British ship commanders, naval commanders, would stop American merchant ships and take off deserters, or men they thought were deserters, who had jumped ship left the British Navy and joined an American merchant marine. About 30 to 40% of the American merchant marine was made up of British subjects. So the Brits had a real case. But how do you tell who's an American, who's a Brit? They sounded alike, they looked alike. Very, very difficult issue, and was struck at the heart of America's sense of nationality. Americans thought that they were going to create a new liberal world, and to create, they would be the most compassionate, the most broad-minded people in the world. And they were going to create the kind of society that went back to the Greeks and Romans, that people had for centuries dreamed about. But little worked out the way they expected, the way these founders expected. The society and the politics became much more democratic, much more populous than they had expected. In a generation's time, Americans experienced, I think, as great a transformation as we've ever had. I know those of us of a certain age have experienced some tremendous transformation, particularly since the 1960s, especially in sexual mores, for example. But I think this generation back then underwent an even more dramatic transformation. And this older transformation took place without the technology, without the technological changes that we've experienced. There was no, this is before industrialization, before urbanization, before railroads, before any of the technological changes that we usually associate with dramatic change. In the decades following the Revolution, Americans changed so much and so rapidly that they became used to change, which was quite extraordinary, and began to celebrate change. No generation in the history of the world had ever celebrated change the way Americans did. The population itself was growing dramatically. The fertility rate was double that of Europe, of Great Britain or Europe. Fertility rate of about seven children per female. Doubling every 20 years or so. And that included the unfree people, the slaves, as well as the free people. And this was, of course, doubling at the same rate it had been doing for the last half century or more, going back to the beginning of the 18th century. And these people were on the move as never before. Americans spread themselves rapidly over half a continent in astonishing speeds. Between 1790 and 1820, New York's population quadrupled. Kentucky's multiplied nearly 8 times. In a single decade, Ohio grew from a virtual wilderness, except of course for the native Indians, whom white Americans scarcely acknowledged. But within a single decade, its white population grew from almost 0 to become more populous than most of the colonies had been at the time of the Revolution. In a single generation, Americans occupied more territory than they had occupied during the entire colonial period, the 150 years. And in the process killed, of course, or displaced tens of thousands of native peoples. Now, although most Americans in 1815 remained farmers living on rural areas, they had become, especially in the North, and I think it is a northern phenomenon. Most of these changes are northern phenomena. In that period, the American people became, in my opinion, the most highly commercialized people in the world. They were busy not only buying and selling with the rest of the world, Europe and the West Indies and Latin America, but increasingly, and perhaps more important, with one another. And nowhere in the Western world was business or working for profit more praised, more celebrated, and more honored than it was here in the United States. This celebration of work, and this is an extraordinary innovation. There's no place in Europe where this is going on to the same extent. Openly celebrating the making of money and working hard. You have to understand, labor and work was considered for thousands of years, going back to the ancient Greeks. Work was demeaning, was despicable. That's why you had slavery. Work was designed for slaves. And of course, as the celebration of work went on, the aristocracy of the South, the leisured aristocracy, became more and more anomalous. And the separation of the sections grew quite rapidly in the decades of the early 19th century. Slavery spread across the southern half of the continent, and as it disappeared in the north, it became more deeply entrenched in the southern economy. When you have the celebration of work and slavery are two sides of the same coin. The South could simply not celebrate work the way the Northerners could, because that would defy their whole system of slavery and undermine it. So you have a growing separation of the sections, not simply on the mode of labor, but on the culture itself. And that, of course, plays into the sectional conflict. In a variety of ways, culturally, socially, politically, the South began to see itself as a beleaguered minority in a bustling commercial nation. That was different from 1790. At that point, Virginia was the nation, in a sense. Virginia was the most important state, the most populous, the richest, the biggest in territory and in wealth. It's not surprising 4 out of the first 5 presidents were Virginians, that the working model for the Constitution was the Virginia Plan. No state has ever dominated the country since in the way Virginia did at the outset. But by 1820, Virginia was already a beleaguered state, seeing itself slipping behind and failing in a way that the northern states were not. All of the demographic and commercial changes, of course, reflected in politics. The period is full of these historical giants. You know them: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Adams, Marshall. And of course, they dominated the politics of the period. But it was not politics as usual. This is just because the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democrats seemed to be political parties like ours. It was far more, as hard as it may be to believe, it was far more partisan, far more serious split in the country than we have even today. The division was really over the kind of nation we were going to become. The Hamiltonian vision was to emulate Europe, to have a fiscal military state that would eventually be strong enough, in Hamilton's mind, to take on the European states on their own terms, to build up the army, create a bureaucracy, have a bank and a debt structure that would enable us to be the equal of Great Britain or France and be able to take them on. It might take 40 or 50 years, Hamilton thought, but sooner or later we would take on the Europeans on their own terms. Jefferson's vision was a very different one. He had a very different view of human nature, and he was opposed deeply, and as followers were as well, to Hamilton's vision. He wanted an agrarian republic without that kind of executive authority. That monarchs, the Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, and the others, believed that monarchs were responsible for war because with war they aggrandized power, executive authority, and that if you could somehow limit war, you could destroy the growth of executive power. That's why Jefferson and Madison clung so strongly, so long, to the embargo, which was the early version of economic sanctions as an alternative to military force. If you could make that liberal experiment work, Jefferson said, then war itself might be eliminated. And that's why he clung to it, even though it was disastrous for the economy. He clung to this embargo on all American trade with the world for 18 months. And Madison believed in it too. It was only the Republican congressman from the port cities, New York in particular, who eventually overturned this grand liberal experiment, as Jefferson called it. Now, in the decades, not only the institutions of government were created, but nearly all of our ideals, our aspirations came out of the revolution. Our beliefs in liberty, equality, constitutionalism, and also the desire to spread democracy around the world. We thought we were igniting a revolutionary force that would spread. And of course, when the French Revolution broke out, we assumed that we had caused it. And Lafayette agreed, because he sent to George Washington the key to the Bastille, which was the symbol of the prison, which was the symbol of the Ancien regime, sent the key to Washington, where it hangs today in Mount Vernon. The politics of the day were much more than great men and political institutions, however. The country became democratized in a way that no one had anticipated or expected. As more and more people gained the right to vote, the essentially aristocratic world of the founders, to which gentry leaders sort of stood for election, was replaced by a modern party-oriented competition, electoral competition for votes. A very democratic world, a recognizably modern world, I think, by the early 19th century. Now, most of these changes took place in the northern states, and they were marked by the emergence of new men into society, middling sorts of men who lacked the kind of genteel attitudes and tenor of the founders. The letter of Benjamin Latrobe, who was the architect and surveyor of Jefferson's public buildings, a letter he wrote in 1806 to the Italian patriot Philip Mazzi. And he's a good Jeffersonian, but he's appalled at what's happening in the state legislatures and in the federal Congress. He complained about the kinds of men getting into the Congress from Pennsylvania. They were ignorant, they were unlettered, and no one was a man of letters, he complained. From the one county was sent a blacksmith, and just over the river, a butcher. Now, this apparently was referring to this butcher. There's a congressman that the secretary to the British legation in a journal that he wrote was complaining about, described as the man who abused his franking privileges, that is the mail privileges that congressmen had, by sending home his linen for laundering, using the franking privileges. But that wasn't much of an abuse, the British secretary said, since he changed his shirt only once a week. When the butcher was invited to Jefferson's dinner at the White House, a practice that Jefferson had of bringing all the congressmen, rotating them through his dining room when he was president, the butcher noted this British witness, observing a leg of mutton, a miserable lean description, could not help forgetting his legislator for a few moments, and expressing the feelings of his profession, exclaimed that at his stall no such leg of mutton would ever have found a place. This is the kind of person that's getting into the government, and it's appalling the older established folk. John Randolph complained that Congress that every Tom, Dick, and Harry, the refuse of retail trade of politics, was getting into the Congress. Now, even when political figures were not ordinary, many now found it wise to pose as such. In his campaign for governor of New York in 1807, Daniel Tompkins, who was a successful lawyer, a graduate of Columbia College, very wealthy lawyer, nonetheless portrayed himself in his campaign for the governorship as a simple farmer's boy, to contrast with his opponent, Morgan Lewis, who was an in-law of the aristocratic Livingston family. So he has to pose as somebody who didn't go to college, just a farmer's boy. In 1810, the New York Federalists figured, well, we got to try the same technique, combat Tompkins, with their own plebeian candidate, a man named Jonas Platt, whose habits and manners, said the Federalists, are as plain and republican as those of his country neighbors. Platt was not a city lawyer like Tompkins, who rolls in splendor and wallows in luxury. So the kind of anti-elitism, they didn't use the term elite, they used aristocratic, but the kind of anti-elitism that we've now become familiar with. You know, politicians don't want to be seen in coats and ties. They want to show that they're regular fellas. You can have beer with them. That kind of thing starts right in the North, starts very early in the first decade of the 19th century. The classic example is in Pennsylvania, where you have Simon Snyder, self-educated guy, no college, no schooling at all, actually, but he could read and write. He was a smart guy. He wore his simplicity and his lack of sophistication as a badge of honor. When his opponents mocked his obscure origins and called his followers clodhoppers, Snyder and his supporters shrewdly picked up the epithet and began proudly wearing it. Being a clodhopper in a society of clodhoppers was no disadvantage, and he went on to become governor of the state of Pennsylvania. You have example after example of this sort of plebeian kind of anti-intellectual, anti-elitist politics, northern, already in the early decades of the 19th century. In fact, Americans became as thoroughly democratic through the whole period that much of the efforts through the period are efforts to control and manage this democracy, starting with the Constitution. The Constitution was designed to bring some of this democracy under control. And of course, the biggest source of control were the courts. And the Federalists' achievement in this period is to create a federal court system which acts to tame and control democratic impulses. More important, I think, through this whole period is that ordinary people begin to discover really a sense of their own worth. That's really new in the history of the world. Ordinary people finding that they are as good as the next guy. And that became a characteristic of Americans, and I think still is. Equality becomes the rallying cry of everyone, and is, of course, the most powerful ideological force in our history is equality. And it's used over and over again through this whole period as ordinary people begin asserting themselves and saying, I'm as good as the person who went to Columbia College or to Harvard or Yale. And in fact, having a degree at one of those prestigious colleges became a disadvantage in some cases in politics. The period is marked by tremendous amount of instability, social disarray, and there are many manifestations of it. Let me mention some of them. Violence of all sorts increased to unprecedented labels. Personal violence, whole families being killed. More murders by a husband or a father shooting his wife and his kids in this period than in any other period, at least in the 19th century. Some bibliographer collected these kinds of this kind of data. Charles Brockden Brown wrote his first novel, Wieland, on this subject. Homicides in New York City took a sudden rise in the 1790s. There were much domestic violence the births out of wedlock increased. About 30% of all births in the measures in the places that have been measured occurred, say, 8 months after the wedding. It probably was a way in which we're not sure why. It probably is the way in which the kids were asserting their independence, because parents were trying to control the spouses, whom you're going to marry, and by getting pregnant, that forces the issue, and the parents lose control. They didn't have you couldn't be single mothers in those days, so the marriage was compelled once the pregnancy occurs, and it probably was initiated by the young people. But at any rate, 30%, that's a huge proportion. Not about close to what we now have. About 40% of our births are born to single mothers in today's world. Drinking of hard liquor increased to unprecedented heights. In fact, by the two studies that have been done, we were consuming more alcohol, hard liquor, mostly whiskey, than any other country in the world, with the exception of Scotland. People drank all day long, and they had dram breaks instead of coffee breaks. And at a court trial, the whiskey would be passed around from the prosecuting attorney to the defense attorney to the judge to the jury. And babies were fed whiskey to calm them down. People became concerned that we were becoming a nation of drunkards. Washington worried about it, although we had a still at Mount Vernon, which has now been open to the public. A little town of Peacham, Vermont, 1,500 people, had 30 distilleries. Unbelievable number of, and of course you know that in Kentucky and western Pennsylvania, whiskey was an easily made, you could turn your grain into whiskey and it was much more transportable than grain would be. Rioting among college students reached a height and a destructiveness that was never duplicated again, even in the 1960s. It didn't compare to what went on in this period. Between 1798 and 1808, American colleges were racked by mounting incidents of student defiance, outright rebellion. Princeton, the one building in Princeton, Nassau Hall, was burned to the ground. Oh, no, I guess it was gutted by fire. And sometimes in retaliation, of course, 40% of the student body would be expelled. Now, these student bodies weren't as large as we have today, but that's an extraordinary count. It was just unbelievable. No one knew why. Some people said, well, it must be because they're drinking too much. Or was it because they were reading too many French writers, Voltaire and others. They simply didn't know. They were shaking their heads, more or less the way we reacted to the 1960 riots. We simply didn't understand what these kids were really angry about. So the same thing happened in the late 90s and the early decades of the 19th century. Religion, too, was democratized and transformed. Not only were most of the traditional European-based religions, the religious establishments, finally destroyed, but the modern world of many competing Christian denominations was created. And by 1815, the United States had become the most evangelically Christian nation in the world. On the eve of the Revolution, the dominant religions in America were the Anglicans, the Church of England, and the Calvinist Congregationalists in New England. By 1790, just 30 years, they had already been supplanted by the Baptists and the Methodists. The Baptists expanded from 90 congregations in 1760 to 858 by 1790, become the single largest religious denomination in the country. The Methodists had no adherents. There were no Methodists in America in 1760, and by 1790 they had created over 700 congregations to rival in numbers the older Congregational and Presbyterian churches. And soon the Methodists, of course, who were anti-Calvinist, took over and came to dominate. By 1810, they were by far the largest denomination in the country, with their itinerant preachers and uneducated preachers going from town to town, preaching in barnyards or anywhere, and bringing in adherents left and right. Evangelical religion spread everywhere, and the most famous gathering of religious seekers took place in the summer of 1801 at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. There, huge numbers of people, together with dozens of ministers of several different denominations, came together with what some thought was the greatest outpouring of the Holy Spirit since the very beginnings of Christianity. Crowds estimated at 15 to 20,000 participated in a week of frenzied conversions. The heat, the noise, the confusion were overwhelming. Ministers, sometimes a half dozen, preaching at the same time from stumps, from buckboards, shouting sermons. Hundreds, if not thousands of people fell on the ground, moaning and wailing in remorse, and they sang, laughed, barked, rolled, and jerked in excitement. Now, America had known religious revivals before, but nothing like this explosion of emotion that took place at Cane Ridge, which became a model for the camp meetings that followed. Now, of course, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was accompanied by the pouring out of lots of intoxicating spirits, and critics of the excesses of Cane Ridge claimed that the frenzied excitement resulted in more souls being conceived than converted. But this became the model, as I say, for both the symbol of the promise and the extravagance of the new kind of evangelical Protestantism that was spreading throughout the country. And it touched off an outburst of religious chaos, really, and inventiveness unmatched in American history. The beginnings of Methodism and Baptism get obscured by the denominational histories that were written later, because everyone wanted to show how respectable they were. And of course, they all did become more respectable. The Methodists began creating, they started with itinerant preachers, with uneducated preachers, but before long they began creating colleges, and by the middle of the 19th century, places like Wesleyan or Boston University and other Methodist schools began, because they wanted to suddenly become respectable. And their wild origins get lost in these denominational histories. But if you go back and look at the reality, it was extraordinarily wild and enthusiastic. Americans also thought that the torch of Western art and literature was being passed to them, and they would make it shine brighter, the sense of culture moving westward across the final stage across the Atlantic. But of course, instead of having the torch of Western civilization being passed to them, their art and literature seemed to be becoming popularized and vulgarized, much to the chagrin of the society's elites. And there's one example I can give you. John Marshall wrote while he was Supreme Court Justice, wrote a 5-volume biography of George Washington, a monumental work, but of course nobody wanted to read it. Instead, they read Parson Weems's short biography, which to elites seemed to be a vulgar perversion of the ennobling art of history writing. Parson Weems is the one who created the cherry tree myth. In Marshall's 5 volumes, he spends 1 page on Washington's youth. Well, Weems spends his whole book essentially on Washington's youth, and of course the book is still in print and sells copies every year. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and made Weems a very wealthy man. But nobody was reading Marshall's book. Popular, and this all left the elites shaking their heads in bewilderment. By 1815, the world of the founders was passing and a new generation was taking over. And most of the founders, and I would say all of them, who lived into the 19th century were disillusioned by what they had wrought. They had begun with so many illusions. They couldn't help but be disillusioned. They hated political parties, and nevertheless parties emerged. They thought they could deal with the native peoples, the Indians, in a humane and respectful manner. They thought the settlement in the West could be orderly and that the Indian culture could be preserved. They lived with that illusion. I mean, the Secretary of War writing to Washington letters about what he hoped for in the West, it just bespeaks an illusion that just couldn't be possible. People were moving too rapidly, white people, into the Indians' territory and were essentially stealing their land by occupying it. The biggest illusion, I think, was the thought that slavery would naturally disappear, especially with the ending of the international slave trade in 1808. Although slavery was put on the road to extinction in the North, it expanded in the South, much to the confusion and bewilderment of people. They really did believe that slavery was going to die out a natural death. There was misleading evidence. Virginia was taking the lead. And as I said, as Virginia went, so went the nation. And Virginia was taking the lead in seeming to be putting an end to the institution. There were freedom suits in Virginia. If you could show that one of your ancestors and anti-slave societies were bringing these suits, it was either an Indian or a white, any one, then the whole line was freed. And there were 10 to 30,000 African slaves were freed by these freedom suits in the 1780s and 90s. Think of this. This is the most extraordinary fact. In 1791, the College of William and Mary gave an honorary degree to Granville Sharp, who was the leading British abolitionist at the time. That bespeaks a hopefulness, an outlook that was undermined, of course, by reality. They had many other illusions, of course, about the future. As late as 1821, Thomas Jefferson thought that there was not a young man now alive who would not die a Unitarian. A Unitarian, what could he have been thinking? I mean, he's a smart man, but the Baptists and the Methodists are sweeping the country, and he thinks everyone's going to become a Unitarian. That's the kind of illusion that many of them had about the future. But before we become arrogant and condescending toward these people in the past, we should realize that we too live with illusions, only we just don't know what they are. Some historian 200 years from now will look back and say, how could they have thought that? We don't know. It strikes me that every generation lives with illusions, different ones for each generation, and in some sense that's how history proceeds, a series of illusions, one generation after the other. Each generation's set of illusions gets exploded and replaced by a new set, and that's what the historical process is really all about. And what I think the one lesson you do get from this, this sense of how history works out, and from this period in particular, is humility. Ultimately, I think that's what history teaches, humility. Thank you.